Now we've got Robin Rossmann back on stage. Robin, super to have you here. You're going to talk about, are we at rock bottom and are we beginning to make the curve up? Are we beginning to see the light? Let's hope. Robin, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I can't think of anything better than to listen to some hotel statistics and data whilst having a cup of coffee. So who needs a break when you've got that? Perfect. So over the next 16 minutes or so, I'm going to look at, are we at rock bottom? And then what does the road to recovery look like? Breaking that up between short term, any green shoots, medium term, when will people start to travel again? And then into the longer term, how long until we get back to 2019 levels? So are we at rock bottom? Spoiler alert, yes, we are. And it is not a good place to be. I think all of us will agree that we hope that we'll never be back in this situation for certainly the rest of our lives. And we hit rock bottom around about the end of March. Here you can see occupancy levels of the 2,000 odd submarkets that we track around the world, from the beginning of the year on the left to where we are currently on the right. You see most hotel markets tracking around about 10 to 30% occupancy, and they have been there since the end of March and slowly etching up, but really not much. And to add insult to injury, that has been on top of some fairly significant hotel closures around the world. So here you can see the proportion of supply that is currently closed, with the Middle East, Asia, Australia, and North America having less closures, around about 20 to 36, 38%, and some significant closures coming through in North Africa, and in particular Europe, Southern Africa, and Central South America. And even with those level of closures, when you look at the absolute levels of occupancy, so this is just showing occupancy of participating hotels that are sharing their actual performance and actually open, you can see, even though there have been those significant closures, the hotels that have left open have still had a tough time when it comes to hotel performance. In fact, it's so dire that I've come up with a new rating system to bring a bit of lightheartedness to it all, and that is classifying hotel occupancies relative to the percentage of alcohol in certain beverages. So in Europe, North Africa, and Central South America, we're having a white wine performance of around about 10% occupancy. Moving down to my home, South and Southern Africa, up more towards red wine territory at 14%. Across in Australia and Asia, heading up towards sake territory, perhaps a bit of fortified wine, around that 20% mark. In the Middle East, we're getting to cocktail levels, and in North America, some hard spirits. Let's hope we can all get to there soon. When you look at the individual country levels, looking at the latest week's occupancy, you can see it is a pretty tough performance in most places. A few exceptions, actually, in the Middle East, which I'll talk about a bit further, where we have had some really decent occupancies relative to most other places in the world. But in the whole, I think it's best if we stick to looking at that kind of metric and forget about the absolute numbers. So on that, and looking specifically at the Middle East, as I shared in the beginning, about a third of hotels have closed across the region, which is certainly less than many other places in the world. And less than I had expected based on the significant declines that we have seen in demand. So definitely that is good news. It is good that the hotels remain open and drive as much demand as they can. Now, there have been some exceptions, obviously Mecca and the travel restrictions. And with that, I'll move on to the level of occupancies across the Middle East. And you can see that there are many markets where it is very low, down below 10%. But there are some exceptions, particularly Abu Dhabi and Doha, Dubai even, where demand is being driven by various alternate uses for hotels, so for quarantine guests and other sources, which is still good business for those regions. But if you were feeling upset about performance in the Middle East, then just compare yourself to Europe and you'll start feeling better. because certainly in terms of regions of the world that have been most affected in the travel sector and the hotel sector, it looks like Europe is going to be impacted the most and probably take longer to recover. Here you can see the number of hotels closed at the end of April, and really it is significant amounts. Unsurprisingly, Spain, Italy, France, the UK, closures over and above 80%. A few exceptions in sort of the Western Europe, Amsterdam, Berlin, Belgrade, around about 50%. And then as we head across to Russia, not that many closures there yet. So when we look at hotel occupancies, very few highlights like we saw in the Middle East, and most markets trading at below 10% occupancies. And what makes it even scarier is that this is the occupancies of only the hotels that are open, so excluding hotels temporarily closed. And when we add those hotels back in, occupancies look more like this. So ranging between 0% in Barcelona up to highs of around about 6% in London. So really, I try and make things lighthearted as I can, but that is a dire situation, and it is unsurprising that we are seeing many companies having significant financial distress as a result. So enough about the bad news. Let's focus on the road to recovery. Obviously, we all hope it's a nice, straight road that we can accelerate down incredibly quickly. The reality is that at best, it's going to be bumpy, and we certainly hope that it isn't going to look like that road on the bottom right. So what is it going to look like? And have there been any green shoots? And we'll start with China, which Jesper Palmquist started the event off this morning, giving greater detail on. So do refer to that if you want more detail on China. But I guess I would give the highlight that, yes, there is light at the end of the tunnel. And it looks like that light is not a train heading our way, but indeed it is recovery. What we have seen, and we're now about 100 days into the recovery cycle in China, is that there was indeed a slow recovery. Occupancies dropped down to that 10% level and slowly recovered up to about 20-25% up until the end of March. So over 2 months of slow recovery. And it really was from the beginning of April that we've started to see normal patterns of business resume, where those dips on the bottom right are the sort of weekend, and then the sort of demand pumping up again during the week. The great news is that over the recent Labor Day weekends, we have seen occupancies spike back up to 50%, and definitely some signs that where consumers are able to travel, they are willing to travel, and that there will be some kind of revenge tourism, if you want to call it, as and when markets are able to open up to tourists again. And what we really look forward to seeing is during the course of May, as business continues to reopen in China, whether or not, and hopefully it does, we see that recovery continuing. What about over in Europe? And just sharing some of the data that we have from Forward Star that looks into the future for a year and looks at business on the books. And so the question is, when we look at Europe, is there any green shoots in that business on the books? Now, there's some people out there that have been talking about massive increases, or at least some increases in bookings. And when you look at the business on the books that we're tracking, there is demand there on the books. You can see a sample of European cities here where rooms sold into the future. So this is rooms already sold in June, July, August, September is up to 30%. However, I think it's still too soon to count on that because when you look at pickup, it is still negative all the way through to October. So what that means is during the month of April, more people were canceling rooms than booking rooms. And so that forward room sold has been decreasing all the time. And it's only when we get to October, November, that we are seeing some positive pickup. And indeed, when you look at the business on the books this year versus same time last year, what we're seeing is that it's only in that Q4 that book business on the books is reaching the level it was last year. So the reality is that it is still too soon to see green shoots in business on the books. But when it does come, I think what we will see is similar to what we've seen in China, is the ketchup effect. Kind of like that newly bottle opened of Heinz ketchup. You're just trying to get out a little bit to have with your fried eggs, but you get about 4 or 5 times more than you expect in that first shunt of demand. And let us hope that is indeed what happens when bookings do start coming back. So let's move to the medium term and answering the questions around when, how, who, and why, and where will people travel again. And so starting with when, and the answer there is quite simple. It is only when governments begin to allow that travel to happen again. And what we've seen in Europe in particular over the past recent week or two is that there is some increasing disclosure of the plans that government have to reopen economies, and in particular, the hospitality and travel sector. What's become clear is that hospitality and travel is at the end of the queue in terms of when it's going to be reopened, and that when it does reopen, it is likely to be subject to some severe and significant social distancing rules. Secondly, how will people be traveling in this recovery? Well, the short headline there is don't rely on too many guests traveling on airlines very soon. Clearly, that is a section of our industry that is probably hardest hit, and there is no doubt that there will be significant capacity constraints certainly this year and into next year, and then some real questions around potential longer-term reductions. So who and why? Well, it's been said before in our presentations and many other discussions, but there is no doubt that when demand comes back, it is going to start with domestic demand, particularly those that don't rely on air travel. It needs to be local and accessible, and it will begin with leisure demand and on the weekends, and probably towards the lower end of hotel classes, so budget and mid-scale. That's certainly what we've seen in China, and I suspect we'll see that in the rest of the world. Then we will see slowly corporate business following that, then some domestic group business, and finally, eventually, international travel resuming. So where will we see that recovery? Well, this is a great set of data from our friends at Tourism Economics, and you can see that looking at some European markets, the ones that will recover sooner are the ones that have a higher proportion of domestic arrivals and less reliance on long haul. So those ones in the top left. So unsurprisingly, a lot of German markets in there and a lot of regional markets. Moving into the long term then, when will demand return to 2019 levels? And this is now heading more towards my personal view more than STRs as a whole, but I think that recovery will look something like a W or some shape of W recovery. And by that I mean we will have, or we have already had, the down phase, where in a matter of weeks, between 2 to 4 weeks, we saw demand pretty much disappear everywhere. Now, the timing of that was a little different depending on where you look in the world. Obviously, China first and then other places later on. But certainly by the end of March, everyone was pretty much at the bottom. And then the next phase is what I believe will be sort of 4 to 6 months of domestic partial recovery. That's certainly what we've seen in China. It's what we're starting to see in the US and elsewhere, where we do see demand come back, but it is limited to domestic demand. And we then have a period where we level out at a new norm, and that stays at that level as long as we don't have a cure for a virus. And social distancing remains in place. What we obviously hope is that there won't be a second wave of infections and that little second dip disappears. And we see that after 6 to 12 months, or indeed however long it takes until we have a cure for the disease, that a full recovery then commences. And that full recovery will be reliant on not just the virus cure, but also a cure for whatever damage the global economy has suffered, and in particular, air travel has suffered. Now, how long will that take? Well, that is anybody's guess. You could be optimistic and be aiming towards the late 2021, 2022, perhaps. But certainly when you look at other scenarios, it could easily be 2027 before we see full recovery back to 2019 levels. And if you want any examples, I can just point you to the 2008-9 global financial crisis, where it took 7 years for RevPAR to recover back to 2007 levels and another 2 for profit. And so whilst that clearly is not a positive outlook, it is still a scenario which we all need to be planning for as a potential one. That being said, as we've always said, and I'll say again now, everything will be all right in the end. Travel is resilient. It will bounce back. I certainly am not in the camp that I think this will change people's behaviors forever and people will stop traveling as much as they used to. I firmly believe it will come back. And it hasn't come back yet, so we're just not at the end yet. And on that, I will add a few minutes back to you, Jonathan, and the team.
Listen, I just wanted to personally thank you, because you have been epitomizing what Jerry said earlier in our conference about communicating to the industry, and you've done a fantastic job. And I know it can't be an easy task either, constantly coming out and telling the industry how bad it is. So congratulations to you, and keeping up that positive vibe as well. I also love your I love the new terms for the industry: revenge tourism. I love that. And also the ketchup effect. I think that's definitely a new trend, the ketchup trend. I love that.
Yeah, I hope that comes true. I did copy it from Christian Streeter, our guy who heads up Germany. So, and I can't take credit for that, but I do like identifying cool, fun things to talk about there and sharing it with everyone. So thank you, Jonathan. And I certainly am grateful that I am doing this online instead of in person in front of a stage, because I'm sure people would be throwing things at me in real life. No, seriously. Yeah, we're here to help any way we can. So thank you.
Excellent. Great. Thanks so much, Robin. And you're going to be, I believe, at your booth at the moment. So if anybody's got any more questions about these figures and want to learn more, just head over to the booth and meet up with Robin and the team. Great. Thanks so much, Robin.
Excellent. Very good. Thanks.